Well, good evening once again. As I was making my way over to the Grant Center earlier this evening, I was mindful of the fact that our second speaker this evening has the unenviable task of trying to occupy the last hour, the day after we all fell backwards with our clocks. So this is probably feeling a little bit later in the evening than it felt the last 2 weeks, and so I'm hoping that all of you can make the relevant adjustments. Perhaps you have caffeine, and I know that it's warm in this room. We've tried to open up some of the back doors to get some airflow in there, so I hope you'll bear with us. As I said at the outset of this evening, Lewis continually wrestled with the deep philosophical concerns about how we think, the nature of our reason, and the role of our imagination. This concern was especially acute for Lewis when he found himself thrust into the spotlight as a Christian apologist. Because of his keen mind, Lewis was famously able to deliver incisive rational arguments for the Christian faith. And some of the most famous of these were originally delivered as broadcast talks for the BBC and eventually collected into the volume that became Mere Christianity. But Lewis also understood that the Christian faith was not merely about rational argument alone. In fact, Lewis recognized the spiritual danger of pride as characteristically afflicting those who merely seek to win arguments for the faith. Perhaps this is partly why he once composed the following evening prayer for the apologist, and this is one of Lewis's poems. From all my lame defeats, and oh, much more, from all the victories that I seem to score, from cleverness shot forth on thy behalf, at which, while angels weep, the audience laugh, from all my proofs of thy divinity, thou who wouldst give no sign, deliver me. Thoughts are but coins. Let me not trust, instead of thee, their thin, worn image of thy head. From all my thoughts, even from my thoughts of thee, O thou fair silence, fall and set me free. Lord of the narrow gate and the needle's eye, take from me all my trumpery, lest I die. As with several others that he wrote, this short poem in the form of a prayer captures Lewis's ongoing struggle with the role and the limits of reason or rational argument in the Christian life. As the poetic form itself makes clear, Lewis often carried out this struggle by means of his imagination, and we are fortunate that he did. For in addition to the Chronicles of Narnia, Lewis produced several other works of fiction that continue to enliven the imaginations of readers everywhere. Lewis claimed that his fiction writing was driven by the imaginative demands of the story itself. And this is no doubt partly true. At the same time, careful readers of Lewis's fictional works see him grasping to articulate deep Christian truths in imaginative ways. Thus, his fiction writing possesses an apologetic quality. Tonight, we are privileged to hear from someone who has given serious thought to the role of Lewis's imaginative works in relation to his rational apologetics. Dr. Micah Watson is director of the Center for Politics and Religion and associate professor of political science here at Union University. That was perhaps a Freudian slip. He is a native of the great Golden State of California, and he cheers rather rabidly for his beloved Lakers, where, when he was an undergraduate, he completed a degree at UC Davis. He went on to receive a degree in church-state studies at Baylor University in Waco, Texas, and he also holds an MA and a doctorate degree in politics from Princeton University. He is the co-editor of the book Natural Law and Evangelical Political Thought, and he has made several important contributions to other recent works as well. His broad interests include political philosophy, politics and religion, politics and literature, and ethics and public policy. He also loves a good movie every now and then. And tonight, we are delighted to have him speak to us on the topic of watchful dragons and the baptized imagination. Will you please join me in welcoming Dr. Micah Watson?
Well, thank you, Justin Barnard, for that introduction and for putting together this series of talks. As Dr. Thomas said earlier, it's a privilege to be able to speak to you tonight. It's a privilege to appear in this series. So many great talks about Lewis. I would be happy to take the label of political philosophy, but my chair and friend, Dr. Evans, is in the back, so I will stick with political science. Very happy to make my home in political science. And well, I'm going to start tonight by telling a story, telling a little bit of history to dovetail with Dr. Thomas's talk. And for what it's worth, it's a true story. When I was in college, I spent my summers working for Christian camps in the Sierra Nevada mountains of California near Yosemite. In fact, I met a young lady there named Julie Lennox at one of these camps, and despite her first impression of me as a know-it-all, she eventually married me. This is not that story. This story is about another camp. And this other camp was near a place called Bass Lake, California, and all the counselors had nicknames there. My nickname was Chewbacca. Now, as it happens, all the young ladies who worked at this camp were equally lovely, but one in particular was more equal than all the others. Her nickname was Critter, and she was a Southern Californian girl. Yeah, we actually called each other these names. It was a lot of fun. She was a Southern Californian girl and a devout Christian, and she attracted quite a bit of attention both at the camp and at her home school or Christian college. Now, when I was that age, and if I ever had the misfortune to be watching a romantic comedy, I usually identified most with whoever the young man was in the movie. Now that I'm a little bit older and the father of 4 daughters and a son, I tend to identify with the father in the movie. I admire speeches that mention shotguns, shovels, and big backyards. But Critter's dad had a more subtle way to interact with the young men who came to his door to take out his daughter. When he would open the door, he'd greet the young man with a firm handshake and bring him into the living room to chat for a bit while Critter finished getting ready. At some point, he'd talk about cars. And he'd ask the young man if he'd like to come out to the garage and see his vintage Porsche. The response was invariably, yes, I would love to see it. And so the two would go into the garage to admire the vintage Porsche in all its glory. After a little bit of conversation back and forth, the dad would say something like this: well, you seem like a responsible young man. Do you know how to drive a stick? Would you like to borrow my Porsche tonight to take out my daughter? The young man's face would light up. Are you serious? I would be honored, sir. That would be amazing. Can I trust you to bring it back in the same condition that it's in right now? You'll take care of it. Drive carefully and slowly. Bring it back without a scratch and in perfect condition. Oh, absolutely. I'll drive very carefully, very slow. I promise to bring it back to you, perfect condition, no dents, no scratches. Critter's dad would then pause for a moment, looking like he was thinking. And then he'd say, well, I'm actually not going to let you take out my Porsche tonight, but I am going to let you take out my daughter. And she means so much more to me than this car. So I hope you can appreciate how important it is that you treat her with a great deal of care and consideration, and that you bring her back without any scratches or dents and in perfect condition. True story. I start with this story for several reasons. First, for any of the young ladies in the audience who hope to be married someday, you might consider looking for a man who will be that kind of dad to your daughters and sons. Second, for the young men in the audience, have you ever heard a more plausible rationale to own a Porsche? You're welcome. This hasn't quite worked out for my garage yet, but good luck to you. The main reason I tell this story is because it illustrates something about how we learn. Actually, the story illustrates 2 things. First, it has a very obvious and straightforward moral. Keep your hands off my daughter. Or to put it in a different way, you would do well to observe the Orthodox Christian teaching about sexuality and treat a woman with respect and consideration that is hers because she is made in God's image and not a plaything for your amusement. But there's another thing going on here too, another moral or illustration from the story, and that is the form of the story itself. When a story works, it can get to an audience in a way that straightforward arguments cannot. If I were mainly interested tonight in defending traditional sexual morality, I could have started off by telling you that, and then proceed to make a rational argument based on reason, going from point to point, and leading to the conclusion that Christian sexual ethics are sound and we should live accordingly. But I suspect most of you would have tuned me out before I finished my first sentence. I at least hope to make it to my 20th or 30th sentence before you tune me out. After all, what's more likely to grab and hold our attention? A story about a lovely young woman, an intimidating father, a nervous young man in a beautiful car, or a lecture perhaps incorporating Kant's categorical imperative that people are to be treated as ends in themselves and not merely means, and that body-mind dualism does violence to a sound understanding of our hylomorphic nature as bodily persons. To ask the question is to answer it, and it is this power of story and imagination to present truths that I want us to consider tonight with regard to C.S. Lewis. For as you know, or know by now, Lewis was enormously gifted in both his right brain and his left brain. He could logic chop with the best of them, and he could create worlds and stories that still invoke wonder generations later. By 1948, before turning the age of 50, he had written several books of straightforward rational apologetics, most notably Mere Christianity, The Abolition of Man, Problem of Pain, and Miracles. Some have said that after a dramatic and now controversial showdown between Lewis and perhaps the most brilliant female philosopher in history, Lewis changed. While his biographers debate the reason why, Lewis did not write another full-fledged rationalist apologetic after 1948. Using that incident as a springboard tonight, we will consider why Lewis focused on the power of story and imagination to communicate the truths about Christianity, human nature, and morality. In March of 1916, C.S. Lewis purchased a book that was to have a profound influence on his faith and writings. While waiting for the evening train, he picked up a copy of Phantastes, a fairy romance by the Scottish author George MacDonald. It is hard to overestimate the impact this book had on Lewis. In his biography, he described his experience reading the book as holiness, as though the voice which had called to me from the world's end were now speaking by my side, end quote. This voice was joy, Lewis's word for the almost impossible to describe longing that flared up in his life from time to time. Reading Phantastes thrust Lewis into the insatiable throes of joy so powerfully that he described it as this: that night my imagination was, in a certain sense, baptized. The rest of me, not unnaturally, took longer. I had not the faintest notion what I had let myself in for by buying Phantastes. What Lewis had let himself in for was a lifelong passion for beauty, imagination, and aesthetics expressed through various forms of the arts. While Lewis's philosophical works are well known, he is more often remembered for his imaginative fiction. Pinning him down into just one category is remarkably hard to do. Lewis scholar and Boston College philosophy professor Peter Kreeft wrote that Lewis, quote, found time to produce some 60 first-quality works of literary history, literary criticism, theology, philosophy, autobiography, biblical studies, historical philology, fantasy, science fiction, letters, poems, sermons, formal and informal essays, historical novel, spiritual diary, religious allegory, short stories, and children's novels. Kreeft continued, Clive Staples Lewis was not a man, he was a world. An uncompromising, rigorous Christianity comprised the common thread that united Lewis's world and the remarkable variety of literary works he produced. Moreover, Lewis did not compartmentalize his thinking. His commitment to maintaining a logically consistent and holistic worldview delayed his conversion to Christianity in his late 20s. Recognizing the philosophical and lifestyle changes that Christianity would demand of him, he only reluctantly converted, describing it this way: in the Trinity term of 1929, I gave in and admitted that God was God and knelt and prayed, perhaps that night the most dejected and reluctant convert in all of England. Who can duly adore that love which will open the gates to a prodigal who is brought in kicking, struggling, resentful, and darting his eyes in every direction for a chance of escape? What a sharp contrast with what the more mature Lewis would write 16 years later, quote, "I believe in Christianity as I believe the sun has risen, not only because I see it, but because by it I see everything else," end quote. Three characteristics of Lewis's thought played an important role in his transformation from reluctant convert to influential Christian apologist. The first was the Christian theological framework within which he addressed any and every subject. The second was Lewis's ability to communicate even the most complex concepts in a clear and compelling manner so that the common person might understand him. The third characteristic was Lewis's magnificent imagination. Lewis's keen imagination was cultivated as a young boy, often confined to a large house with his brother with nothing to do but play and read, making up imaginary worlds and reading book after book after book. No TV, no internet, no texting, no computer games, just make-believe and books. This combination of Lewis's imagination with his remarkable intellectual gifts, he was writing his commentary on Milton's Paradise Lost at the age of 10. This combination was potent and would remain so for the rest of his life. There is a key event in Lewis's life that I've already mentioned that some think really tested his faith and reason. At Oxford University, Lewis attended the meetings of what was called the Socratic Club, a debating society that would hear the very best Christians and atheists and agnostics argue about their respective worldviews. Lewis was the president of this society, and he was a formidable debater. Yet in February of 1948, a young Catholic philosopher named Gertrude Elizabeth Margaret Anscombe, she went by G.E.M. Anscombe professionally, you can see why, critiqued a chapter from Lewis's Miracles. While not as well known now as Lewis, Anscombe was a formidable thinker and a remarkable character. She was the most significant student of the philosopher Wittgenstein and went on to an equally remarkable, not equal to Wittgenstein, I'll just say a very remarkable career in philosophy, while also having 7 children, getting arrested twice for protesting abortion in England, and also calling out President Truman as a war criminal for dropping atomic bombs on Nagasaki and Hiroshima. She also smoked and wore pants at Oxford, which really wasn't done then by ladies. So what happened in this debate? By all accounts, it seems that Anscombe exposed a serious weakness in Lewis's argument against naturalism, naturalism being the view that all there is nature, all there is material. She did so in a rather robust and aggressive manner. Some of Lewis's friends later reported that Lewis was mortified by this experience, which then led to some biographers claiming that this experience caused Lewis to lose his faith in the power of reasoned argument. One biographer, Ian Wilson, goes so far as to say that Lewis was so embittered by this debate that he created the character of Jadis, the White Witch, in the Narnia books, as a manifestation of Anscombe herself. Another critic, John Beversluis, claims that this debate, along with the death of Lewis's wife in 1960, brought the once robust rational thinker to a confused, sad, and broken man who could barely hang on to his faith. Beversluis bases his argument on his reading of Lewis's journal following the death of his wife, which has since been published as A Grief Observed. Lewis's wife, Joy Davidman Gresham Lewis, died of cancer following a remarkable reprieve of 3 years in which she and Lewis enjoyed a great deal of happiness. Describing Lewis after her death as a picture of human collapse, Beversluis concluded that, quote, "the apostle to the skeptics had himself become a skeptic, if not about the existence of God, at least about his nature," end quote. Beversluis is right that toward the end of his life, Lewis did not engage in the spirited apologetics or rational reasoning that had made him famous earlier in life. He never wrote another book-length apologetic work like The Abolition of Man or The Problem of Pain. Beversluis's observation is sound on that score, but his explanation goes too far. Lewis did not lose faith in rationality or reasonable objectivity. Yet Lewis's retreat from straight apologetics does raise a question. If Beversluis is wrong to attribute the transition to a loss of faith in reason, then what is the correct explanation? The correct explanation is that Lewis began to doubt not the legitimacy of reason, but the efficacy of reason in a society that was increasingly resistant to the claims of logic and rational argument. Lewis's change was in tactics, not in substance. As Gilbert Melander observes, much of Lewis's writing can be understood as an attempt to provide compelling Christian images which might shape and mold men's thinking about the kind of life they live and the kind they ought to live. The best example of Lewis's new strategy is found in his space trilogy. And I won't assume that you've all read the space trilogy, but as Dr. Thomas was working with the Narnia Chronicles, I'm going to be mainly working with the space trilogy. In the first book of that trilogy, Out of the Silent Planet, Lewis writes himself into the book as a minor character who appears at the end. He is a friend of the main character, who is Ransom, also a professor of philology. At the conclusion of the book, after Ransom has returned from the planet Malacandra, I won't give you all the plots, no spoilers, although Malacandra is Mars, so I'll tell you that. Ransom writes a letter to the fictional Lewis, and they're trying to figure out how best to communicate what Ransom has learned during his adventures on Mars. Both men ponder how to communicate the importance of Ransom's newfound knowledge without being laughed at. Lewis writes, the fictional Lewis writes, or the real Lewis writes the fictional Lewis writing, "It was Dr. Ransom who first saw that our only chance was to publish in the form of fiction what would certainly not be listened to as fact. He even thought, greatly overrating my literary powers, that this might have the incidental advantage of reaching a wider public. To my objection that if accepted as fiction, it would be for that very reason regarded as false, he replied that there would be indications enough in the narrative for the few readers, the very few, who at present were prepared to go further into the matter. Anyway," Ransom continued, and this is the key point, "what we need for the moment is not so much a body of belief, but a body of people familiarized with certain ideas." End quote. Out of the Silent Planet was published in 1938, 10 years before the Anscombe debate and 22 years before Joy Lewis died. As we will see, this and other passages demonstrate that Lewis was already laying the groundwork to emphasize imagination and narrative over rationalistic apologetics. Bevis Lewis's picture of human collapse thesis is not sound. This alternative explanation, that Lewis did not lose faith in reason but shifted to fictional apologetics, better fits with what Lewis said about himself and with the opinions of those who knew him best. The question remains, however, as to why Lewis changed strategies. What led him to think that his efforts would be better spent on more imaginative works? Here, I'm afraid, we have to delve a little bit into Lewis's view of human nature, and Lewis borrows heavily from Plato. At least this part, it is all in Plato. So human beings are a combination of head, characterized by reason and wisdom, heart, characterized by emotions, or thumos, the Greek word for spirit, and the stomach, characterized by our desires. The good man or woman will have these three things properly ordered, with reason, the reason of the head, ruling the desires of the stomach with the help of the well-trained emotions or spirit of the heart. In a disordered person, the desires of the stomach are in charge, and the stomach gets reason to get what the stomach wants, regardless of whether what it wants is good or bad. Education, then, means strengthening reason and training emotions to feel the right way about the right sort of thing. Gilbert Melander, again, says this very nicely. Every impulse in our nature is to be bridled, controlled, and guided. A right response to the problems of life is not something automatically present in our nature. On the contrary, it involves a delicate balance of trained habits, laboriously acquired and easily lost. By inculcating right response, moral education will play an important role in enabling people to act in accord with the maxim of moral knowledge, end quote. Lewis uses this head, heart, stomach schema most explicitly in Men Without Chests, the first part of his book, The Abolition of Man. He writes that man is different from beast and from spirit because of the trained emotions of morality that reside in the chest, in between the animalistic stomach and the cerebral, spiritual intellect. Lewis writes, "It may even be said that it is by this middle element that man is man, for by his intellect he is mere spirit, and by his appetite mere animal," end quote. Now, with this understanding of human nature from Lewis, we can understand a little better of why he shifted to narrative and imagination. Times have changed. Modern men and women, Lewis believed, no longer, know how to think. And we no longer know what to do in those rare times when we do think well. Here we do well to listen to how Lewis describes this himself through the voice of one of his famed creations, the senior demon Screwtape, whose job it is to advise his nephew and lower demon, or I should say perhaps higher demon, Wormwood, This is in the book, The Screwtape Letters. Wormwood has been assigned to a patient, an ordinary human being, and Wormwood's job is to draw that patient slowly, perhaps, to, in Screwtape's words, our Father below. In other words, lead him to hell. And here is what Screwtape says in his first letter to Wormwood.
I note what you say about guiding your patient's reading and taking care that he sees a good deal of his materialist friend. But are you not being a trifle naive? It sounds as if you suppose that argument was the way to keep him out of the enemy's clutches. Now, that might have been so if he had lived a few centuries earlier. At that time, the humans still knew pretty well when a thing was proved and when it was not, and if it was proved, they really believed it. They still connected thinking with doing, and were prepared to alter their way of life as the result of a chain of reasoning. But what with the weekly press and other such weapons, we have largely altered that. Your man has been accustomed, ever since he was a boy, to having a dozen incompatible philosophies dancing about together inside his head. He doesn't think of doctrines as primarily true or false, but as academic or practical, outworn or contemporary, conventional or ruthless. Jargon, not argument, is your best ally in keeping him from the church. Don't waste time trying to make him think that materialism is true. Make him think it is strong or stark or courageous, that it is the philosophy of the future. That's the sort of thing he cares about.
And that's taken from John Cleese, who has an audio performance of the entire Screwtape Letters, which I would highly recommend because John Cleese is fantastic. And Screwtape Letters is fantastic, so it's a twofer. What's the import, what's the meaning of this quotation, this disembodied demonic spirit who's talking to us, right? Focusing on rational arguments doesn't make much sense in a culture that has rejected rational arguments. Times have changed. Lewis believed that several factors had changed Western culture. He made his most succinct articulation of those changes in a little-known essay called Modern Man and His Categories of Thought. Lewis listed several changes. First, as already covered by Screwtape, modern man has a general and casual belief that reason is not a valid means of proving anything. Irrational causes, such as biological or economic background, are the real origin of thought. Lewis wrote of modern man that, quote, he accepts without dismay the conclusion that all our thoughts are invalid, end quote. Second, a revolution in education has rejected traditional thought in favor of an isolated provincialism. And this has to do somewhat with history. This educational provincialism rests on what Lewis called chronological snobbery, in that each generation thinks it is superior to all the preceding ones. This cuts off each generation from all the wisdom and the folly of the ones before, leading to a narrow intellectual vision and no standards by which to judge contemporary thought. The third change in how modern man thinks is what Lewis called developmentalism. This idea pertains to the modern faith in progress. Everything is getting better and better and better. Lewis says life should come out of the inanimate, reason out of instinct, civilization out of savagery, virtue out of animalism. This idea is supported in modern man's mind by a number of false analogies. The oak coming from the acorn, the man from the gametes, the modern steamship from the primitive boat, the supplementary truth that every acorn was dropped by an oak, every gamete derived from a man, and the first boat by something so much more complex than itself, a man of genius, is simply ignored. The modern faith in progress contrasts sharply with the Christian worldview. Lewis noted that Christianity teaches the best creates the good, and the good is corrupted by sin. For developmentalism, the very standard of good itself is in a state of flux. The next factor Lewis called proletariatism, all these isms. This is basically talking about a collective boost in self-esteem that occurred for the working class people in many Western countries. As a result, regular people are, quote, self-satisfied to a degree perhaps beyond the self-satisfaction of any recorded aristocracy. They are convinced that whatever may be wrong with the world, it cannot be themselves, end quote. We see a version of this in our own contemporary politics in that the American people are never wrong. It's always Congress or the politicians, not the people who put them there. In regard to Christianity, Lewis noted that this self-satisfaction puts God in the dock or on trial and makes Christian religion a means of earthly comfort rather than supernatural truth. One consequence of this widespread point of view is arguably the spread of victim politics and culture wars. Finally, the last factor I'll mention here, Lewis noted that practicality had surpassed truth for modern people. This changes the discussion about faith and morality from, is it true, to the question, will this help me? For political affairs, the effect of the transition is that political conversation is almost exclusively concerned with means rather than ends. Lewis believed it was important to take into account the particularities of modernity for the purpose of apologetics. Despite the official ties between his country, Great Britain, and the Church of England, Lewis said the age of Christendom has passed. He refers to himself in his autobiography as a converted pagan living among apostate Puritans. And in Mere Christianity, he describes the Christian as living in enemy-occupied territory, called by God to take part in a great campaign of sabotage. But how to influence enemy-occupied territory, given all these characteristics of modern man? Such a society, in Lewis's view, is cut off from an appreciation of the past, committed to the ideal of unlimited progress, self-satisfied, concerned with technos rather than telos, and skeptical about reason. In addition to these factors, one must consider the increased religious, racial, and moral pluralism in Western culture. Despite the difficulty, however, we can discern in Lewis's work a consistent theme about how Christians should be God's secret agents living in enemy-occupied territory. If appealing to the head is no longer as effective as it once was, Lewis believes we can appeal to the heart, and stories, images, and imagination are the key to doing this. Lewis's fiction is written with this in mind, and we really shouldn't be surprised that Lewis, the lover of myths and stories, and the Christian should go this route. After all, the greatest moral teacher and communicator of all time spoke in parables. Lewis offered several negative reasons why appealing to the head would no longer work: historicism, proletarianism, loss of reason, etc. But perhaps his strongest arguments stem from the nature of Christianity and Scripture itself. In his book on prayer, published after his death in 1964, Letters to Malcolm, Lewis addressed the issue of biblical exegesis and the relationship between the anthropomorphic descriptions of God, God as having hands or God as doing human sort of things, and the abstract systematic theology of higher biblical criticism. He suggested two rules for reading Scripture. The first was never to read biblical imagery as literal. In other words, Jesus did not proclaim that he was literally a loaf of bread. The second was to nevertheless trust the message of the images. Here's what he says. He says, when the meaning of the images, what they say to our fear and hope and will and affections, seems to conflict with the theological abstractions, trust the meaning of the images every time. For our abstract thinking is itself a tissue of analogies, a continual modeling of spiritual reality in legal or chemical or mechanical terms. Are these likely to be more adequate than the sensuous, organic, and personal images of Scripture? Light and darkness, river and well, seed and harvest, master and servant, hen and chickens, father and child. The footprints of the divine are more visible in that rich soil than across rocks or slag heaps. End quote. Without relegating Lewis's straightforward apologetics to the status of rocks and slag heaps, his imaginative fiction does communicate the truths of Christianity in much the same fashion as scriptural imagery. His writings are sensuous, organic, and personal. Because his fiction is beautifully written and his stories compelling, Lewis's fiction can succeed in winning hearts and minds where his rational argument cannot. Even so, we must not think that Lewis wrote, say, the Narnia books as allegorical exercises in illustrating Christianity. Reflecting on how the Narnia books began and his motivation to write fiction in general, Lewis described the origins of The Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe as this. Everything began with images: a fawn carrying an umbrella, a queen on a sledge, a magnificent lion. At first, there wasn't anything even Christian about them. That element pushed in of its own accord. End quote. Later, Lewis, though, acknowledged that the Christian element in these stories could have an effect he had not foreseen. Writing that obligatory religion, forced religion, had paralyzed his faith as a child, Lewis hoped that his fiction could present the same Christian truths, but without the expectations that can stifle faith. Here's what he says. Stories of this kind could steal past a certain inhibition which had paralyzed much of my own religion in childhood. Why did one find it so hard to feel as one was told one ought to feel about the sufferings of Christ? I thought the chief reason was that one was told one ought to. An obligation to feel can freeze feelings. But supposing that by casting these things, Christianity, into an imaginary world, stripping them of their stained glass and Sunday school associations, one could make them for the first time appear in their real potency. Could one not thus steal past those watchful dragons? I thought one could. Now you've seen where I got the title for this talk. The potency of the Christian message is often muted by other dragons as well. Is it possible that Lewis's imaginative fiction can steal past the dragons of postmodernism, rational skepticism, and other conditions of the modern mind? Of course, the nature of imaginative fiction is such that this question cannot be answered scientifically. The strength of narrative fiction is that it has the potential to bypass the pitfalls of rationality and demonstrable argument. One should not then expect to measure its success in influencing culture by rational and demonstrable criteria. That Lewis, the real-life author, followed the advice given by Lewis, the fictional character in The Silent Planet, has been attested to by many, including Lewis himself. But what does this look like? In the time I have remaining, I want to dive into one particular episode in Lewis's imaginative fiction, drawing from the third book in his science fiction trilogy, That Hideous Strength. This book takes place in England and includes a number of insidious characters who form the National Institute of Coordinated Experiments, NICE. Think the NSA with the worst aspects of the post office and signing up for health care, all these things wrapped in one, only very, very efficient. One of the most vivid of these characters in the NICE is Professor Frost, an ardent materialist. The NICE is attempting to create a scientific technocracy which will control the entire country. Frost is the human embodiment of Lewis's conditioner in the last chapter of The Abolition of Man. Unlike other characters in the space trilogy like Weston and Paralandra and Out of the Silent Planet, Frost does not bother trying to build a new morality around some one innovative principle. He is above all things objective, claiming to see human nature and himself as though it and he were nothing, but natural objects to be studied with complete detachment. The last third of That Hideous Strength portrays a psychological confrontation between Frost and another university professor, the sociologist Mark Studdock. Mark is Lewis's depiction of the typically educated modern man, and I'm afraid Lewis does not hold a lot of esteem for sociology. So if Dr. Heckler ever listens to this lecture, I will have to offer her my apologies. Lewis has some serious doubts. Frost intends to initiate Mark into his version of objectivity, threatening him with a false murder charge if he resists, while promising him unlimited power and influence if he goes along. During the interrogation, Frost reveals his commitment to objectivity. "Before going on," said Frost, "I must ask you to be strictly objective. Resentment and fear are both chemical phenomena. Our reactions to one another are chemical phenomena. Social relations are chemical relations. You must observe these feelings in yourself in an objective manner. Do not let them distract your attention from the facts," end quote. Frost tells Mark that one of the main experiments of the NICE is to establish contact with macrobes, powerful spiritual beings such as the one encountered in Out of the Silent Planet. When Mark asks if these beings are friendly, Frost again displays a complete materialist objectivity. Frost says, "If you reflect for a moment, you will see your question has no meaning except on the level of the crudest popular thought. Friendship is a chemical phenomenon. So is hatred. Both of them presuppose organisms of our type. The first step towards intercourse with the macrobes is the realization that one must go outside the whole world of our subjective emotions. It is only as you begin to do so that you discover how much of what you mistook for your own thought was merely a byproduct of your blood and nervous tissues." Frost's ultimate aim for the future of humanity is the reduction of civilization to a technocracy of the special objective few. The great majority of the human race has fulfilled its function by acting as a sort of cocoon for the emergent new man, shades of Nietzsche here. As such, the great majority of people are no longer necessary and must be done away with. Frost, like some other protagonists in the space trilogy, sorry, minor spoiler here, but he meets with an untimely and unpleasant demise. Lewis offers us a glimpse of Frost from his perspective. For years, he had theoretically believed that all which appears in the mind as motive or intention was merely a byproduct of what the body was doing. But as time passed, the theoretical became the actual, and Frost's mind became a mere spectator, unable to challenge the purposes of his body. In the end, Frost sets himself on fire in an attempt to escape the illusion of consciousness, only to find that death itself might not, after all, cure the illusion of being a soul, nay, might prove the entry into a world where that illusion raged infinite and unchecked. Lewis's version of hell. Lewis illustrated through Frost's character his argument made in the straightforward abolition of man. Man, freed from all morality, becomes enslaved to his physical impulses. In creating the character of Frost, Lewis gave a human countenance to the moral innovators and social conditioners he described in the straightforward arguments. As effective as the abolition of man is as an argument, and I love the abolition of man, the character of Frost lives and dies and illustrates that argument in a vivid and memorable way. Lewis also used the characters of Frost and Mark Studdock to illustrate his belief in reasonable objectivity, that morality is real, it's something that we can count on, it's something in the world, and to be mistaken about it is like being mistaken about the existence of math or Mount Everest. Shortly before killing himself, Frost attempts one final effort to break down Mark's resistance to the NICE. Frost takes Mark into what he calls the objective room. The objective room was, quote, the first step towards what Frost called objectivity, the process whereby all specifically human reactions were killed in a man. The room was ill-proportioned, and here I would ask you to use your imagination as I read this description. The ceiling too high and the walls too close together, somewhat like a coffin. Strange pictures hung on the walls. There was a portrait of a young woman who held her mouth wide open to reveal the fact that the inside of it was thickly overgrown with hair. There was a giant mantis playing a fiddle while being eaten by another mantis, and a man with corkscrews instead of arms bathing in a flat, sadly colored sea beneath a summer sunset. This is kind of the negative imagination, right? The room teased the mind by seeming to have a discernible pattern, but the closer Mark examined any aspect of the room, the less ordered and more surreal it seemed. But Mark's reaction was not what Frost had intended. Lewis describes a change that began to occur in Mark's mind. The built and painted perversity of this room had the effect of making him aware, as he had never been aware before, of the room's opposite. As the desert first teaches men to love water, or as absence first reveals affection, there rose up against this background of the sour and the crooked some kind of vision of the sweet and straight. Something else, something he vaguely called the normal, apparently existed. Mark Studdock, the modern agnostic and religious skeptic, had discovered through his encounter with the objective room a part of his nature he previously did not know existed. Lewis wrote, quote, he was not thinking in moral terms at all, or else, what is much the same thing, he was having his first deeply moral experience. He was choosing aside the normal. Frost later tested Mark's newfound allegiance to the normal by another visit to the objective room. This time in the center of the room was a large, life-sized crucifix, painstakingly detailed and lifelike. Frost commands Mark to walk on the crucifix, trampling it underneath while performing other obscenities on it. This scene depicts the first inkling that Mark has of the relation between his newly discovered notion of morality and Christianity. Though never a Christian, Mark finds himself uncomfortable with Frost's demands, though disobeying them would likely result in his death in the very headquarters of the NICE. Here, Lewis's account is worth quoting at length. "Pray make haste," said Frost. The quiet urgency of his voice and the fact that he had so often obeyed it before almost conquered him. He was on the verge of obeying and getting the whole silly business over when the defenselessness of the figure deterred him. The feeling was a very illogical one, not because its hands were nailed and helpless, but because they were only made of wood and therefore even more helpless. because the thing, for all its realism, was inanimate and could not in any way hit back. He paused. "What are you waiting for, Mr. Studdock?" said Frost. Mark was well aware of the danger. Obviously, if he disobeyed, his last chance of getting out alive might be gone, even of getting out of this room. The smothering sensation once again attacked him. He was himself, he felt, as helpless as the wooden Christ. As he thought this, he found himself looking at the crucifix in a new way, neither as a piece of wood nor a monument of superstition, but as a bit of history. Christianity was nonsense, but one did not doubt that the man lived and had been executed thus by the NICE of those days, and that, as he suddenly saw, explained why this image, though not itself an image of the straight or normal, was yet in opposition to crooked Bellbury, Bellbury being the headquarters. It was a picture of what happened when the straight met the crooked, a picture of what the crooked did to the straight, what it would do to him if he remained straight. It was, in a more emphatic sense than he had yet understood, a cross. Lewis illustrated the doctrine of moral objectivity through Mark's reaction to the crooked. For the first time in the narrative, Mark has identified a standard of sorts by which he can order his behavior and attitudes toward the events around him. No longer afraid of dying for his newfound allegiance to his ideas of the normal, Mark turned to Frost, and answering Frost's demand that he walk on the crucifix, saying, more prophetically than he knew, "It's all bloody nonsense, and I'm damned if I do any such thing." Lewis does not neatly resolve Mark's the story with a conversion of Mark to Christianity, but he did demonstrate in fictional form Lewis's belief that the standards of morality and the good are built into the universe. Mark's reaction to the sourness and crookedness of the objective room acted as a catalyst in awakening within him a sense of the sweet, straight, and good. Lewis's characters, and we've just looked at two, Lewis's characters in the Space Trilogy are just some of the many examples of Lewis's fictional apologetic. The Chronicles of Narnia and other fiction conduct apologetics in ways his rational arguments cannot. Francis Schaeffer echoes this point in explaining why secular critics like B.F. Skinner respond to Lewis, but not to evangelical Christians. B.F. Skinner had read The Abolition of Man and said, "That's great. Man's abolition is long overdue. The sooner we get on, the better." Here's what Schaeffer writes. "Twice Skinner specifically attacked C.S. Lewis. Why? Because he is a Christian and writes in the tradition of the literatures of freedom and dignity. You will notice that Skinner does not attack the evangelical church, probably because he doesn't think it's a threat to him. Unhappily, he is largely right about this. Many of us are too sleepy to be a threat in the battle of tomorrow, but he understands that a man like C.S. Lewis, who writes literature that stirs men, is indeed a threat." End quote. Lewis's fiction is a threat to a secular worldview such as Skinner's because it provides a means by which Christianity and the moral law can be transmitted to a skeptical culture. Lewis's straightforward apologetic and natural law arguments will only go so far in a pluralistic society. How then to make the case? What are we trying to do? Gilbert Melander again notes this difficulty. He argues that Lewis's solution for the ethical and moral problems of society is found not in Plato or Augustine necessarily, but in Aristotle, and in an Aristotelian moral education. In The Abolition of Man, Lewis refers to Aristotle's form of education. He says, Aristotle says that the aim of education is to make the pupil like and dislike what he ought. When the age for reflective thought comes, the pupil who has been thus trained in ordinate affections or just sentiments will easily find the first principle in ethics, but to the corrupt man, they will never be visible at all, and he can make no progress in that science. This is education for the heart. Melander writes that this stress on moral education could be said to be the strongest and most permanent theme of Lewis's ethic. However, the moral education Lewis envisioned could not be taught as biology or sociology or political science could be taught in a classroom. Moral education, according to Melander's reading of Lewis, happens when youths, young people, are surrounded by mentors and family members who model the moral precepts. Morality, what Lewis called the Tao, is passed on through initiation, as grown birds deal with young birds when they teach them to fly, and men transmitting manhood to men. Lewis's Chronicles of Narnia and his contribution to the moral education are the contribution to the moral education of his young readers. The Chronicles, along with the space trilogy Until We Have Faces, contain numerous examples of characters performing moral deeds, obeying the precepts of the Tao. Alongside the positive examples are those who transgress the moral law, defy God. Sometimes these characters are redeemed, as is Edmund in The Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe, and sometimes they destroy themselves, as do Frost and Weston in the space trilogy. Melander nicely summarizes how Lewis's fiction transmits moral education. These stories serve to enhance moral education, to build character. They teach, albeit indirectly, and provide us with exemplars from whom we learn proper emotional responses. We can think once more of one of the principles of the Tao, the law of magnanimity, willingness to expend oneself in a good cause, and not like to die for your country. It is, Lewis thinks, a message best communicated indirectly, through the father's own example, and also through stories read to his son. The father's message may well be communicated through a story like The Last Battle. There, in a passage cited at the outset of the chapter, Runwit, the centaur, while dying, sends a message to King Tyrion, telling him to, quote, "Remember that all worlds draw to an end, and that noble death is a treasure which no one is too poor to buy." End quote. To overlook the function of the Chronicles of Narnia in communicating images of proper emotional responses is to miss their connection to Lewis's moral thought. The fictional legacy left behind by Lewis offers us one of his most potent methods of influencing a culture resistant to the claims of Christian revelation and natural law morality. Lewis's positive and negative arguments for the natural law may fall on deaf ears. His abstract depiction of the horrors of a Tao-less society may be ignored or even welcomed. His preferred picture of politics may be rejected as too restrictive by modern liberals and too worldly by conservative evangelicals. But his fiction has the potential to slip past watchful dragons and cultivate the authentic and rich dark soil which bears the footprints of the divine. Yet for some, this combination may be deeply unsatisfying. It does not offer much in the way of action for most of us. Perhaps a few like-minded Christians with exceptional literary talents can continue Lewis's work by creating art that reaches hearts and minds, but it would seem that his moral education solution would leave the rest of us to be content with merely distributing good literature and reading stories to our children. Perhaps that's enough. But despair is not an option for Lewis in this sense. The breadth and richness of Lewis's worldview does not allow for a despairing conclusion. It is imperative to remember that Lewis himself did not measure success in terms of societal outcomes. In the conclusion to the Narnia series, The Last Battle, Narnia itself is destroyed as her noble inhabitants struggle to remain faithful to God amid the destruction of all they know. Society, nations, natural life itself are valuable so long as they are properly ordered. For Lewis, these are secondary things. Ultimately, one must understand Lewis's thought within the context of his Christian universe. The practical problems of Christianity, politics, and culture are important, and Lewis offered some resources with which to deal with these problems. The theological and ethical questions regarding the problems of pain and God's relationship to the good are difficult.